Everything we call color has three attributes or axes, and we know these as value, saturation, and hue. Value is the simplest to talk about, since color is simply dark and light differences. Every color reflects or projects varying amounts of light, and there's no absolute standard for the correct amount of any hue. We can't really say, we can't use purple for this problem. Purple's too dark, because you can add lightness to purple, and it is still purple. Well, what we're looking at here is a gradation from black to white, and it's very easy for us to see this as one concept, a gradation. When we break it up into smaller parts, we can handle this much more easily as chunks of information. But when we break down the differences between those different chunks of information, we'll notice here that right here at this band, this band, this band, this band, that the dark part seems to get a little darker here, and the light part seems to get a little lighter. And now that you've been staring at this for about 60 seconds, maybe you're seeing it too. There's nothing wrong with your monitor. That is called Mach banding, M-A-C-H banding. And it is part of your visual system because we are so attuned to edges, we will create high contrast differences even if they don't exist in those edges. This is a 9-step grayscale in between black and white. That means there's white on top, black on the bottom, and 9 steps of gray in between. This gives us 10% increments, and it's very easy to learn value this way. Many art schools give an assignment of creating in paint a value scale like this. Once you've learned this, and it's like bicycle riding, once you learn it, you don't forget it, you can look at a color and say, you know, that's 65% gray, and it's an enormous help for you to be able to analyze things that way. Well, if I turn the background to 50% gray, you'll notice that the beginning part is now grouped with the background. The dark part on the bottom seems a little darker. The light part, though, is very dramatically lighter, and I've done nothing digitally to this other than add a background. When I change that background to complete darkness, the light part seems to be quite luminous, almost glowing at the edges. Well, that's, again, part of the human visual system. We are going to be much more sensitive to lights on a dark field, and they tend to blossom, they tend to bloom and glow, and it's actually a little disturbing. Where do we use value? We use it for everything we see. The human brain loves value. It is really all we ever want. You can watch an entire 2-hour black and white movie and never go, where's the color? Because we can follow life. We can figure out where stop signs are, say stop and go. We can figure out where doors are so we don't bump into them. We can go through our entire life without color. It won't be as much fun, but we can survive without it. Well, in line, we need contrast for line, pretty much. We barely even think of something as a line unless there is some dark light contrast involved. So it works for line work, and it works obviously for large areas of background like this. Now, this is not the world of painting. This is the world of drawing. And line is something that we all start with. When you first started to do artwork, it is not likely that you started with paints. It's more likely that you probably started with line, and that's because our brain, our primary visual cortex, wants edges. That is how we make sense out of the world. Now, this is a painting. It's not line anymore. But she stands out because she is light against a considerably darker background, and it is her light silhouette against a dark background that defines this entire picture. There is color in it, but it is not something that one would remember. It does not make a big impact. There are many reasons why we've used a lot of darkness or lightness and not a lot of color, and some of them are cultural. At many points in history, especially European history, black was a favored color because it was a Protestant color. It was a statement against the indulgences, the perceived indulgences of the Catholic Church at that time. So people wore black to talk about their humility and their basicness, in a way, that they were not ostentatious. At that time, painters painting, as you can see on wood panels here, not on canvas, were very sensitive to subtle, minute differences in blacks. Chiaroscuro is a method of using very strong high contrast differences, usually from a single point light source, so that light and dark is how you define an image. And this marks the beginning of artists actually considering light to be what it was they were supposed to show in a painting. Up until this point, paintings were somewhat conceptual. that they were always lit with a soft general light with no or not much sense of shadow and not much sense of highlight, that people were people, and it doesn't matter if they're lit at different times of day, it's still the same person. But with chiaroscuro, and in this case with Caravaggio, we are now capturing a moment. We're not capturing an absoluteness of a person who was alive yesterday and will most likely be alive tomorrow, but we're capturing a moment, and that is a sensitivity to light and dark contrast. Caravaggio certainly used light and dark contrast for almost everything he did. He rarely used much color, and when he did, the color was almost always simply red. Now, this has a lot more color in it. In fact, this has close to rainbow in it, although there's no violet and there's not much red. Its impact is the sharp line that occurs when you see this very brilliantly lit carved stone building in Petra through this crevice in the rocks. That crevice is the painting almost, and what you see beyond it is treasure practically. But that is the structure of this painting, a very vertical structure, and it's based on value. Goya's famous May 3rd, 1808 painting is a colored painting, but color is actually incidental. There is some blood on the ground, but it is that white shirt that people remember. And when you in an art history class may refer to this painting, it is most likely that victim in the white shirt that you remember. Usually an artist will make a point and surround that white with darkness, so they stand out as a big silhouette. But this was meant to be a bigger, more emotional general impact, and not so much about form, but about a moment. Okay, this is the opposite. We're looking into a bright thing, the sky. And things that are not so bright in front of us are silhouetted because our eyes can process only so much light, and we can't really get into detail much. But I've been talking for about 30 seconds now, and maybe by now you're realizing that this isn't a silhouette painting. This is a red and green painting, but it's taken that long. It takes a number of seconds for you to start noticing that the value, which is what hits you first and which gives you that first sense of pleasure in looking at the painting, is a beginning step, but it's not the entire story. There's a lot more going on here than that. But we want value. This man is silhouetted against a light sky. There is almost nothing as dark as he and his horse is, although there are some shadows on the ground miles away from him. That means that this was done to create a bold, somewhat heroic silhouette. And that is the point of this. It is not about color relationships, nor is it about line. It's about one single area defined by being dark against a light background. This is also about silhouette, but now we have some value relationships and even very, very subtle color relationships. There is color in here. There's a blue sky, there is some orange in the ground for dirt, and there is even some hints of green here and there. But primarily, this is, again, a silhouette against a silhouette. So it's a little bit richer than the painting that we just saw. Saturation, the second axis of color, is not brightness. This is a common misconception. Brightness is not a word that belongs in color theory very well because it confuses us. Light colors are bright, but so are intense colors. So saturation is actually purity and intensity. I knew somebody once who said that saturation was color squeezed out of the tube, and that is not a very useful definition, because if you squeeze gray paint out of a tube, it's not saturated, it just simply hasn't been mixed with anything yet. Saturation is a perception of intensity. We now live in a world in the 21st century in which we have saturation around us every day. 500 years ago, saturation was rare. It was found in flowers. It was found in bird feathers. But it was hard to create it in textile fabric and hard to create it in paint, with some minor exceptions. In this particular painting, the fabric is what is most saturated. Now, she has a ruddy red glow, and so does she. And this dead head has none of that redness in it anymore either. So part of the meaning of this painting is that she is alive and he is dead. And you can tell by simply their complexion. But the big impact of the painting is fabric. And this is going to be true throughout our entire DVD practically. The paintings I'm going to be referring to are often from an era in which fabric was one of the biggest challenges to paint, because that was where you could really manipulate color and be proud of something that human beings made. I hope this helps you understand what saturation is. Obviously, that fan and that kimono are highly saturated, and nothing else in this image can actually come close to matching the intensity of that saturation. The chair is highly saturated, and this is an unusual choice. But if the chair is this saturated, then the person sitting in the chair is not going to seem as intensely colored. And for some subjects, that is actually exactly what you want. This person wants to seem modest. She is wearing black and white. She has pale skin. And if she were seen against a black wall, you would be much more aware of the intensity of her complexion. But right now, you compare that to the chair and think, oh, well, her complexion is very pale because the chair is so vivid. This is a Pre-Raphaelite painting by Edward Burne-Jones, and this was created in the mid-1800s. Why that's so special, and why the color looks different here than it did in the Middle Ages, is that the 1800s provided us with an explosion of new paints, and they were far more saturated than artists had ever had to use before. The Pre-Raphaelites were one of those groups of artists that was fascinated with these new saturated paints and tended to really almost show off their saturation. There's no metaphorical meaning to the color that I can tell you about. I'm not aware of it. Not all the color is saturated. This certainly is not saturated back here, but this fabric and the flowers and these other fabrics are highly saturated. If you saw this in a photograph, you would be suspect. You would think that somebody went in Photoshop and actually changed that a little bit. This is done hundreds of years earlier. But again, it's fabric in which the saturation occurs. There is not a lot of saturation in nature, as I hinted at before. Saturation is found in little tiny exceptions in nature. Saturation in nature is found in insects and butterflies and birds and flowers, sunsets to some degree, sometimes trees in the autumn. But those are all sort of exceptions. Most of nature is sort of brown and gray. Many people who are painters have been told that they need to stress browns and grays in their paintings, in a sense, that you cannot use color straight from the tube because that's just simply not what nature is made of. In the 21st century, that's a somewhat old-fashioned idea now, but if you are trying to represent nature, there is some sense to it. This is called At the Dressmakers, and I mentioned the title only because the saturation of the fabric is the point of this. Yes, there is some social contact, but this is almost all about rendering fabrics and showing you how bright they are. Notice that there's almost nothing on the wall behind our subjects that is going to contrast or is going to challenge the intensity of those fabrics. This is highly saturated, as were a lot of the paintings that Maxfield Parrish did. We are looking at a sunset scene in which the sun is to our backs. So everything we're looking at is being bathed in warm horizon light sunlight. Now there's something in this painting that you could not photograph, and that is red light, making this very red, making these clouds red, making the trees red, is going to make green things look brown. So this green is somewhat fanciful and decorative. It's not unattractive, but it's also not the way that sunset light would actually work.